This is Grain IQ. I'm Chad Moyer. Grain marketing is a critical piece in keeping your operation profitable. Last episode, we explored the domestic uses of grain produced here in the United States. In other words, how does the U.S. use the grain that is produced by our nation's farmers? Where does it go? Well, today we're going to take that one step further and explore international markets. What countries are our main customers? How do they utilize U.S. grains? Elaine Cubb joins us once again for today's conversation. She's a market analyst and the author of Mastering the Grain Markets: How Profits Are Really Made. Elaine, we've talked a lot about domestic use of the grains, corn, soybeans, and wheat, and how we utilize it here in the United States. Let's talk about international demand for grains. And it's probably a good point to make, the fact that the way that we use grains in the United States is a way that it's used in a lot of places in other parts around the world, right?
Exactly. I mean, the actual destination of the grain in some ruminant animal's stomach is pretty much going to be the same wherever it ends up. And it doesn't have to be a ruminant animal, I should clarify. But to the extent that we use, our grain ultimately either to produce some food product for humans to buy at a grocery store, like cornflakes or whatever, or to feed to a livestock animal and turn it into meat, and that will be a human food product, or fuel, as the case may be. That's what anybody else, anywhere else in the world is going to do with the stuff too. The stuff is useful in these same ways everywhere.
Yeah. And maybe the thing that would be different, I guess, is the ratios, right? Because you talked about before how vegetable oils and how that affects soybean oil, that's a major source of calories in some parts of the world. But we are also seeing other parts of the world really pick up on this biofuels movement too, right?
Yes, that is true. And, I don't know to what extent various foreign countries are still bound by like the Paris agreements, but that had been the case for the past 5 years, that there were a lot of countries in South America or Southeast Asia, so not just China, but other Asian countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., who had really made these commitments to use more ethanol, to use more biofuels in their fuel mix. And that became a big market for U.S. ethanol. So I guess it is different, or it's important for us to think not only just of how we export the raw grain to our various customers and then their customers' customers, but we're also exporting what the industry calls grain in all forms, which is we are exporting the ethanol itself. And that's one of the reasons why whenever anybody talks about an ethanol blend wall in the United States, you really kind of don't have to worry about it too much, because even if people don't use it in the United States, somebody elsewhere will probably use that ethanol and we can ship it out to them. So yeah, ship it out as ethanol, or we ship it out as DDGs. I don't think many people realize what a big movement that is to put DDGs into containers and ship them out in containers. In fact, that's the biggest way that the supply chain crisis affects our traditional conventional grain markets. We are typically shipping them out in big ocean-going vessels if we're just shipping out conventional soybeans or conventional corn, but we're shipping out a lot of DDGs and soybean meal and soybeans, identity preserved specialized soybeans, in containers. And those containers are going to strange locations, going to Turkey. Turkey is a big DDG customer. China is a big DDG customer, of course. Also, China is a big customer of everything. But yeah, it's amazing how we can get this stuff out our doors, out our ports, to everybody everywhere.
I'm thinking of the aquaculture industry in parts of Asia that uses a lot of soybean meal. So that could be a pretty significant driver for exports that direction, right?
Yeah. And again, that is the best case scenario for the American soybean industry, is to process it here domestically and get that value add, keep that crush margin as a domestic profit here in the United States, even if it's not directly going to farmers, but it might be paying back to farmers as higher basis or stronger basis, or if they're part of a co-op that is participating in some of those crushing activities. If we do the crushing here domestically and then ship out the soybean meal, that's golden.
Maybe let's break it down a little bit by commodity. Can we talk about corn exports? What seems to be major destinations for U.S. corn?
Yeah. Okay, let me back up just a little second, just to go back to this aquaculture thing. It's also in Norway. They are experimenting with aquaculture to put it right next to the population centers. So rather than, having the fish, out in the ocean or wherever, they're creating these facilities that are closer to the population centers to get rid of the transportation problems in that sense. And that's an interesting model that we can consider globally. And I also kind of wanted to talk about what proportion of the feed market and for corn goes to all of the various livestock industries. And here in the United States, most of it is for beef feed, but that's 27% beef feed, 18% for dairy feed. So the majority of it is some form of cattle. Corn goes 26% to hogs and 27% to poultry and only 2% to others. So that does go to your point about aquaculture. And yeah, if we looked internationally, it would be a bigger portion to aquaculture and to hogs and to poultry than to the beef.
So as far as international destinations go, where does it seem like there's a lot of U.S. corn going to?
Yeah, well, I can tell you all of the agricultural exports, the biggest, most common movement is to ship it on a train or a barge down to the Gulf of Mexico and then put it onto an ocean-going vessel in a big bulk carrier. And then that stuff is going to China or to Colombia or Japan or South Korea. Another big movement for corn specifically is to put it on a train and go to Mexico. When you think about exports and we have this visualization of putting it in a big ocean-going vessel, we forget about all of the exports that leave on the ground on a train going directly into Mexico to their livestock feeding industry. So those are the biggest, most common movements.
Yeah, and like you say, big movements, but just here in North America, because of USMCA, NAFTA before it, things like that, there was a lot of good reasons to take corn either north of the border or south of the border, right?
Yeah, and those rail rates going from Nebraska, specifically even straight down to Mexico, the rail rates are very favorable, and that's a very profitable movement.
Maybe you can talk just about the logistics. Like you said, we put it on a rail and we get it to a port terminal. What does that grain have to do to get to its destination?
Yeah, I've got some numbers, specific numbers. So let's look at soybeans. Let's say you've got soybeans that are worth $12.60 on the farm in North Dakota, in eastern North Dakota here this last harvest. And then it would take maybe 36 cents to truck that to the next destination, which would be an elevator that's amassing all of this stuff together. I think the trucking costs probably were higher than that this fall, but these are numbers that USDA had in a grain transportation report. Anyway, if you got an elevator in North Dakota, let's say, and you're going to try and ship it out to the Pacific Northwest, which is another common movement for our conventional grains, it would take $1.57 per bushel in rail freight to get it from the Eastern Dakotas to the Pacific Northwest, and then another $1.20 in ocean freight to get it from the Pacific Northwest to, let's say, Shanghai, China. So the biggest portion of transportation costs is rail. But ocean freight got a lot more expensive this past 6 months than it had been. That's about double what it was at its cheapest point. But it's still not as bad as container shipping, of course. Container shipping got very expensive during the supply chain crisis. But even the bulk shippers did have some higher freight prices.
Elaine said it is important to understand that the grain has to be handled several times before it reaches its final destination. And simply put, that adds up.
That example that I gave where you're taking soybeans worth $12.60 in North Dakota and making them land in Shanghai for $15.70. That is the simplest. I mean, that's a rare, very simple process that it might go through. But you're absolutely right that it could be much more complex. There could be lots of middlemen and middle stages and commingling of the commodity grains. But that's really, honestly, that's the power of commodity grains, is that they are standardized and that they can be commingled in this way and be traded globally. And you know exactly what you're going to get with any bushel of number 2 yellow corn or soybeans.
We talked about destination of U.S. corn. What about U.S. soybeans? What seems to be common destinations for our bean crop, Elaine?
Yeah, again, number 1 is to ship out of the Gulf of Mexico or the Pacific Northwest, or the top 12 agricultural exporting ports, most of them, 8 of them are on the West Coast. Washington, Kalama, Washington, Longview, Vancouver, Portland, Oregon. Those are the big ones. But I would also like to point out the proportion of soybeans that get shipped out in containers has been growing. And I think to a degree that people don't realize, something like 6 to 10% of all of our soybean exports are going out in containers. Some of those are going out of the East Coast, Norfolk to Vietnam, Thailand, because these soybeans that are going out in containers aren't usually the conventional soybeans. They're typically the specialty identity preserved soybeans. But I think it's interesting to flag that just because it's a much larger proportion that I realized before I looked into it. And I don't think a lot of people realize how sensitive the soybean industry actually is to the container shipping problems.
Yeah. And you talk about some of those specialty crops. And again, this is kind of a sidestep, but the fact that what used to be a niche market, a low use market here in the US only, really is starting to attract some international business, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is really going to sidestep because I know that we're supposed to be talking about international usage, but I'm going to take it to the battle for acres, right? If you think in 2022, what are people going to grow? It's because we do have these interesting markets for the specialty grains, for your lentils and your field peas. We have so much more interest from consumers for the fake meats, right? But that's made out of soy protein or field pea protein isolates. So there's more and more processing that is done for some of these specialty crops and more outlets for it to get into a grocery store and into consumers' hands. So the prices of them are extremely high, and they're right in the mix of something that people are going to keep looking at. This is true also even that hemp, movement, right? When grain prices are low, people are always looking for these specialty crops. But when grain prices are high, specialty crop prices are high too, and people are looking for them then.
So we've covered the main international destinations for corn and soybeans, but we haven't touched on wheat yet. So how does wheat get used across the globe?
Well, United States has been called the world's elevator for wheat. And the reason for that is that we tend to our wheat market tends to just work as sort of the inventory for the world, that we tend to keep more of our stocks sitting in elevators. Our corn stocks to use ratio is maybe 10% and soybean stocks to use ratio is 8%, but our wheat stocks to use ratio is 32%. We just tend to keep a lot of it in inventory for the rest of the world. But we do export it. We're not the biggest exporter. Russia is actually the biggest exporter to the global market. And they go to Egypt, Nigeria, all of the Middle East, North Africa. Our wheat also goes to some of those same places, but a lot of it gets used domestically.
Well, what about, there's a lot of wheat that comes out of Australia. Is that a big competitor to us too?
Yeah, it's a similar type of wheat, but it would be a competitor to China to the extent that we ship wheat to China, which we don't very much. Their wheat is typically just geographically cheaper for them to get over to that hemisphere. But I'm just looking here at a list of the biggest exporters. Looks like Australia, 25.5 million metric tons. Russia is 35 million metric tons. The European Union is 37.5 million metric tons. So if we consider that just one country, they would be the biggest one. Ukraine is big, 24 million metric tons. That's bigger than the United States with only 22 million metric tons. So those are your big ones, but there's also Argentina is a big exporter of wheat, and Canada too, at 15 million metric tons.
So as the wheat that's shipped out of the United States, is it kind of the same as domestic usage? Is it going towards feed, or is it ending up as a carbohydrate food source?
Well, I think ideally we want to be shipping out the higher quality wheat because there's more value to that. But I do think that, yeah, some U.S. wheat gets exported. And again, that rail shipment down to Mexico is a feed usage shipment. Yeah.
Since Elaine has over 15 years of experience in this industry, I asked her to elaborate on how she's seen international destinations for U.S. grains change over time.
Yeah, and this is a story that we hear a lot about, and it's been a long-term thing, and it just never seems to, it's still ongoing, is the westernization of Asian diets. So where most of their cereal grain consumption may have previously been rice, there's more of a willingness for them to eat a hamburger on a hamburger bun, and that requires wheat, for instance. So we do see Asia, the Middle East and North Africa starting to be a bigger player in the global imports. And just mentioning the word Africa, it makes me think, if you think of a projection of in our lifetime where we may continue to see growth potential for wheat usage and wheat export destinations, I think that's one to look at. But right now it's not huge. Nigeria is a big importer. I mentioned that, 6.2 million metric tons. North Africa is a big importer. But the biggest ones individually is China, imports 9.5 million metric tons. Bangladesh imports 7.5 million metric tons. India produces most of their own wheat, but they're obviously a huge country with a huge population, so the potential may be there someday. But yeah, that's my expectation, is to see that westernization of Asian diets continue, and there's a destination for our wheat.
Whether it's a domestic ethanol plant, biofuels plant, whether it's an international feed destination, why is that important? What part does that play in what we do, boots on the ground here in the middle part of America? How important is that to understand that?
Well, you want to grow something profitable so that you can stay in business. But even more urgently than that, I mean, the big marketing task of any grain producer is to decide when to sell the grain, what price to accept for the grain. So in order to make that decision, folks need to have an outlook. They need to have an idea or ideas about whether the price is going to go up or down. So to the extent that you keep track of, are your customers profitable? What threats are down the line for your customers? If you can see some threat that all of a sudden ethanol production is not going to be profitable anymore and ethanol plants are going to stop buying as much corn, that's a threat, and you need to lock in your prices now urgently if you see that coming before the markets collapse. So that's why it's important for grain marketers to keep track of these global, not just domestically, but global perspectives of who might be losing money and might have a bearish threat to prices in the future.
Or like we've talked before, if you have an emerging market, if you're keeping tabs on something that, is all of a sudden going to be new to the market, you can adjust your production system at home and take advantage of that too, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talked about some of those specialty crops or even the wheat, like the trends of the market to the global market to demand different sorts of grains. Absolutely. If you can predict that for the next 5-10 years, that gives you some ideas of what direction to take your business.
Elaine, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for your expertise and your insight. Appreciate it very much.
You bet. Thanks, Chad.
Elaine Cubb, a market analyst and author of Mastering the Grain Markets, How Profits Are Really Made. This is Grain IQ. I'm Chad Moyer.
Grain IQ is a production of the Nebraska Rural Radio Association with support from the Nebraska Soybean Board. It is brought to you in part by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. Grain IQ is hosted by Chad Moyer and produced by Rebel Saklocha. It is written and edited by Alex Wojcicki. Our project manager is Bryce Duskett. You can listen to Grain IQ on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or online at ruralradionetwork.com.